shortly before 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday the 29th of December 1170. As the heavens drew in and dusk cast a dark veil across the city's labyrinth of rooftops, Archbishop Thomas Becket was retiring in his private quarters of the Archbishop's Palace, talking with his closest aides and attendants following a large banquet lunch. Yet unbeknownst to him, his recent actions had inspired outrage in the king, and tempers were flaring. Henry II, who was currently in France, had moved 4 knights to slip across the Channel to England to rid the realm of his high ecclesiastical dignitary. And so begins this tragic tale. Thomas Becket had been fighting a losing battle for some time. The lines had already been drawn when he was elected Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. What should have been an argument conducted between the highest representatives of church and state had become fatally enmeshed in a clash of personalities, and with that, the tragedy began. Henry, having initially been delighted at Becket taking over as Archbishop, assumed his former carousing chum and chief administrator of far lower social standing would be easily manipulated into obedience and sympathetic to the royal cause. But he wasn't, and Becket had even prophetically warned the king that his elevation would bring the friends into conflict. "For several things you do in prejudice of the rights of the church make me fear you would require of me what I could not agree to," Becket told the king, "and envious persons would not fail to make this the occasion of endless strife between us," in that he was proved spectacularly prescient. In what struck some contemporaries as a miraculous conversion, Becket swiftly resigned his role as Chancellor and began to assert his commitment to defending church rights. He resisted multiple of Henry's objectives. The central disagreement was over clerical privilege, most notably the king's hopes to use him to force through a radical programme of royal supervision of the church, including its burgeoning judicial system, but was prevented by Becket's refusal to assent to his more extreme demands at Clarendon in January 1164. Coming to a head at a fierce confrontation at Northampton Castle that following October, Becket was labelled a traitor and a whoremonger, and he found himself without option but to flee to France in fear of life and limb. And so he made his retreat. By now, the ever-widening rift between the church and crown had widened to seemingly unbridgeable dimensions. Something had to give, for they had long passed the point where any rapprochement was possible. The Archbishop also knew that Henry's temper was explosive, and he was ruthless in pursuit of his rights. Notoriously scheming, he was even given the epithet the Lion in Winter. Becket knew this better than almost anyone. But the damage done to their relationship, already precarious at best, was done. On this occasion, the king's intransigence and rage was to produce bloody murder. Upon Becket's return to England in 1170, in a fit of anger, he excommunicated those bishops who had diplomatically supported Henry in his pursuit to dislodge clerical privilege. Over in the Great Hall, the servants were still finishing up their meals when, without warning, the knights charged through the palace gates, the horses' hooves thundering down on the cobbles below. Without haste, they made their way through to the courtyard, casting aside breastplates and garments under a nearby mulberry tree. They strode into the hall, together with a thin crowd who had gathered to bear witness upon hearing the uproar. As was customary, they were politely welcomed and offered nourishment by the palace servants. This was scornfully rejected, and they demanded the presence of the Archbishop. Admitting the knights to the Archbishop's privy chambers, Becket was found there sitting atop his bed taking counsel. He did not move, nor acknowledge his unannounced guests. He deliberately kept them waiting, though inwardly he prepared for his fate. When he finally turned to greet them, a bitter duel of words ensued. The knights demanded his arrest by order of the king. "In the king's name we command you, both clerks and monks, to seize and hold that man lest he flee before the king can take full justice on his body." His crimes and insults to the crown were reeled off. Calm and poised, he goaded them with disconcerting alacrity, daring them to try. Not all, though, were as resolute as Becket. As panic overtook his surrounding clerks and monks, he bore the tirade stoically. Afire with rage, the knights could do little else at that moment but retreat. Capturing his porter and one of his armed men as hostages as they exited, this provoked Becket to pursue them as far as the door, and, scarcely able to contain himself, he demanded their release. Contemptuously they took no notice, and fled into the city to collect retainers and weapons. This was a bleak omen. Barricading the door shut, Becket knew they would not be long in returning. Resuming his seat as the commotion was thrown up around him, Becket was frozen, more by the fear of indecision and the chill that permeated his robes than the possibility of his impending death. He was faced with a decision. Should he barricade himself in Christchurch Cathedral like a thief seeking sanctuary, or relent to the demands of the rebel knights? He weighed his options. Neither suited. Now, as dusk settled, Becket was poised to receive his fate. He would give himself to his death willingly, in a righteous cause, fighting for God, justice, and for his church, knowing that in martyrdom he would find a place in heaven amongst the saints and those brave clergymen before him. And within the hour his resolve was tested, for the knights had returned to the episcopal palace, covertly entering through the orchard. At that moment, Becket's fellow monks burst into his chambers and urged him to make haste and flee to the sanctuary of the cathedral, where, they argued, the men would be reluctant to follow. But these men were eager to hunt Becket down. They would break through the ranks and spiritual liminalities and stop for no one until they cut him down. Though Becket contemplated his options, his monks did not wait to hear his response and instead dragged him towards the connecting door which linked to the cloister. Unmoved by the exhortations, prayers and tears of his spiritual comrades, Becket remained firm in his place and waited for vespers. As the bells began to toll for the evening service, the monks hurried Thomas through the cloisters. The dark clouds of an angry sky set in, and a fearsome wind howled around the arcading, a harbinger of the devastating scene that awaited them. Yet he went calmly, each step slow and deliberate, waiting even for his cross to be borne by a clerk of Auxerre before him, as if he was readily preparing himself for death. With his agonizingly slow pace, he walked last, like a shepherd driving his flock, his associates tugging at his garments lest the knights catch up to them. For a moment, Becket hesitated, peering over his shoulder with a measured glance in a bid to see whether the soldiers were closing in on him. Not so at that point. As the procession entered the church, vespers was already underway in the presence of townsfolk in the nave. The darkness of nightfall was closing in, the only light thrown from the monks' candles and oil lamps. He paused at the threshold. The service was abandoned as the monks swarmed about Becket, rejoicing that he was alive and unharmed. Many also fled, while others pleaded for him to leave the holy house or take cover in the creeping darkness from the looming barbarians. But again, he was prepared for his fate. With that, the terrified monks slammed the cloister door to the north transept behind him and pulled on the bolt, which slid as if in liquid glue. Becket turned toward them and ordered that the doors be left open. "It is not proper," he lamented, "that a house of prayer, a church of Christ, be made a fortress although it is not shut up. It serves as a fortification for his people. We will not triumph over the enemy through suffering rather than by fighting, and we come to suffer, not to resist." As he marched toward the door to prevent it from being closed, many ran to his aid, surrounding him like a human shield. With his ascetic army in tow, Becket began ascending the steps to the high altar in the choir, the church's holiest point. As his foot hit the fourth step, the cloister door swung open with an almighty fury. The sacrilegious men stormed the house, having ransacked the palace, brandishing their drawn swords in the air, bellowing, "Where is the Archbishop of Canterbury?" Silence. They repeated this time with even more zeal, "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and the realm?" Pandemonium ensued as those who had been attending vespers gasped in shock at the armed gang and the horror playing out in front of their eyes in God's holy space. "The righteous will be like a bold lion and free from fear," Becket whispered to his surrounding comrades as he descended from the steps. Stepping out of the gloom, his gaze lit on his executioners. "Here I am, not a traitor of the king but a priest. Why do you seek me?" He was now stood, still encircled by a pillar of the arcading in the north transept. "Absolve," the assassins barked, "and restore to communion those who you have excommunicated, and return to office those who have been suspended." Becket's reply came without hesitation. "No penance has been made, so I will not absolve them." "Then you," one of the knights retorted in a spirit of fury, "will now die and will suffer what you have earned. And I am prepared to die for my Lord, so that in my blood the church will attain liberty and peace. But in the name of Almighty God, I forbid that you hurt my men, either cleric or layman, in any way," Becket retorted. With these words, at the foot of a pillar, he turned to the right. On one side was the altar of the Blessed Virgin, her statue hanging above, and on the other the altar of St. Benedict. Seeing the butchers with drawn swords, and the hour which would bring the end to his mortal life upon him, Becket bowed his head, joined his hands together and elevated them above as if in prayer, commending himself to the cause of the church, repeating the names of the holy archbishops who had been martyrs before him. A few remaining monks clamoured around him, in some hope that they might secure his sacred protection, but they were no match for Henry's men. They had given chase, and now their prey was in their midst, a trapped bird in a net. Becket had barely finished speaking, when one impious knight, fearing that he would be saved by the people and escape alive, suddenly set upon him. One by one the people scattered like ants, wondering when the next footstep would fall. William de Tracy rushed at the archbishop. With his whole strength, the inept knight brought down the weapon upon Becket's extended head. The blundering blow sliced off the top of his cranium, which the unction of sacred chrism had dedicated to God. Rather than cutting cleanly through Becket's neck, the blade slammed down, tearing through the clergyman's shirt and hammering into his shoulder bone, the only sound that of the crunch of iron through flesh and bone. In the onslaught, cleric Edward Grimm, who had stood his ground closest to Thomas, instinctively threw out his arm in a heroic attempt to shield the holy man and deflect the knight's savage blow, receiving a slice almost to the bone, nearly severing his own arm in two. As he cried out, a furious Reginald Fitzurse howled to his companions, "Strike! Strike!" Goaded on, these butchers, adding wound to wound, were set to dash out Becket's brains through foul and cruel butchery. As blood gushed down Becket's face, he fell to his knees in an embrace of death, offering himself as a living sacrifice. Agonizing while clasping and stretching out his hands in mercy to God, de Tracy closed in from the other side and slashed again, the second blow smiting the top of the priest's head, causing him to fall prostrate beside St. Benedict's altar, his arms still outstretched. As he lay in torment, murmuring, Richard Brito, raving with furious cruelty, took up his sword with both hands. The sword fell quick, and struck Becket with such force that the whole tonsured crown of his head was sliced clean off, sparks flying from the blade as it thundered down against the pavement before shattering into shards. As the abhorrent act was executed, Brito screeched, "Take that, for love of my Lord William, the king's brother." Clearly the knights were settling some old scores. In this case, William, a favourite of the king, had allegedly perished of a broken heart in 1164 as a direct result of Becket's refusal to license his marriage to the widow Isabel de Warenne. The odds truly were not in the archbishop's favour. While the final, fourth assassin, Hugh de Morville, continued holding back the onlookers, rather than partaking in the action, the coup de grace was delivered from one of his followers, a renegade clerk by the name of Hugh of Hornsey or Moorclerk for his evil ways. Stamping his foot on the neck of the holy priest, he drove the sharp point of his sword through the open wound and gouged out his brains. But Moorclerk had not finished. Using the heel of his boot, he then mashed them together with the blood and smeared the ghastly concoction across this cold stone pavement. The royal henchmen, elated in their triumphal act, now dispersed through the cloister, crying out, "Let us away, knights! He will rise no more." Violent rain suddenly hammered down, as thunder crashed from the open heavens. There was a long pause, and then, as if the monks had suddenly been brought back to life, scurried towards the haunting sight that presented itself before them. It was a horrific crime in itself, but given the status of the victim and the sanctity of the space, it was an outrage beyond comprehension. To paint King Henry II as a brute killer, the iniquitous villain of the piece, and Archbishop Thomas Becket as the blameless victim, is somewhat misleading. Both were guilty of mounting hubris and a thirst for power which erupted in a titanic struggle between two great egoists of English history. Still, the brutal murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on the 29th of December 1170 sent a thrill of horror across medieval Christendom. One of the most grotesque acts of butchery ever seen throughout the Middle Ages, it threatened the stability of the Angevin Empire, made the murder victim into one of the most celebrated saints in the Middle Ages, and established Canterbury as the centre of a pilgrimage cult that embraced the whole of the Latin West. It truly was a momentous event.